Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's panel. It's wonderful to be here. Before I start, I wanted to send a thank you out to the Linda Hall Library for inviting us all to be here this evening and for putting together such a beautiful and creative exhibit on the search for life beyond Earth. Truly, if you haven't had a chance to see it, please spend some time looking around and reading the information. It's just fantastic. Of course, this panel is part of the programming that's related to that exhibit, and so I'd like to spend a couple of minutes connecting the dots between the topic of our panel and the search for alien life. I think it's wonderful that you have chosen to celebrate the history and the evolution of a question that I think many of us are innately interested in, which is, are we alone? Is anyone else out there? And of course, this is a question that until relatively recently lived mostly within the realms of philosophy, speculative, or science fiction, and not so much within science. But now we are lucky to be living in an age where looking for life beyond Earth is a priority among the science community as well. It's certainly something that I think about every day as a science journalist. As you heard, I specialize in covering space exploration and astrobiology, which challenges us to understand life's origins here on Earth, as well as its distribution throughout the cosmos. I was also lucky to have a father, Frank, who for most of his 92 years focused on figuring out how to answer the question of whether we are alone. And Dad made many contributions to the field that actually helped push it from the fringe into the mainstream of science. I'm going to tell you about two of those. In 1960, Dad conducted the first search for extraterrestrial technologies. He called it Project Ozma, and he used a radio telescope in West Virginia to search for radio transmissions coming from two nearby sun-like stars. And Dad's reasoning went like so. If those stars had planets in orbit around them, as our sun does, and if those planets are anything like Earth, with civilizations that are anything like ours, then like us, they might be releasing radio waves into the cosmos that would be distinctly artificial in origin. And Dad had calculated that his telescope, this one, was sensitive enough to detect those signals if they were at least as strong as what we on Earth were emitting. And of course, the only technologies that he found evidence for were our own terrestrial technologies. But in 1961, the next year, he codified that reasoning that I just walked you through into what we now know as the Drake equation, which calculates how many civilizations there are how many detectable civilizations there are in the Milky Way galaxy. That's our galaxy. And it's not an equation in the same sense as something like E equals mc squared. It's more of a framework that you can use to answer really big questions. Because as you step through each of these variables, they challenge you to figure out what you need to know if you want to keep moving down that path toward an answer. And so depending on how optimistic you are and what you think the values of these variables are, the Drake equation tells us that the number of detectable civilizations in the Milky Way is somewhere between 1, which is us, and potentially billions. So what does that have to do with the topic of our panel tonight, which is unidentified anomalous phenomena within a scientific context? Well, in any field of science, there is a boundary between what we know and what we don't know. And some would argue that in the search for life beyond Earth, UAP live at that boundary. And by UAP, of course, I'm referring to the objects in our skies that were formerly known as UFOs, and which by definition are unidentified. But in literature and in history, we humans have associated UFOs with aliens, with the alien, the otherworldly, the unknown. And in some ways, they have come to represent the ways in which we deal with ambiguity and how we make sense of things that we really cannot explain. And today, the term UAP has evolved to include any objects that we don't understand that exist in space and underwater, as well as in the skies. Now, if you go back to the Drake equation, and you think about everything that we're learning about exoplanets, which are planets that orbit other stars, about habitable environments, about life's tenacity here on Earth, about the distribution of life's building blocks in the cosmos, you might rightly conclude that the probability that in this vast galaxy we inhabit, the probability that alien life exists is probably pretty darn high, right? And you might wonder, well, are there any aliens nearby? Have they maybe visited us? There is actually an intellectual continuum there that connects those dots. Now, plenty of people certainly believe that we have found evidence of extraterrestrial life here on Earth already. In 2021, a Pew Research poll found that roughly 2/3 of Americans think that intelligent aliens exist on other planets, and that 51% think that we have already found evidence, or probably found evidence, of those technologies here on Earth. That the UFOs that the US military has identified are either definitely or probably evidence of alien technologies. That's 51%. But science is not a democratic process, and the language of science is data. In 2022, Congress created the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO, which is jointly managed by the Department of Defense and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. AARO's job is to lead the US government's approach to studying UAP using a scientifically rigorous and data-based framework. To date, AARO has collected around 1,600, a little bit north of 1,600 UAP reports dating back to 1996. Of those, the number of reports that include objects that are behaving truly anomalously, and this is defined by the previous director as anything that can't be readily explained by either a human or a sensor, something that's doing something weird. The number of those reports is in the single-digit percentages of the entire caseload. Investigators in the office have managed to explain hundreds of those cases already, and in those instances, the objects that they typically see involved are things like balloons, drones, satellites, birds. And of the unexplained cases, they say the vast majority are unexplained because the data that we need to come up with an explanation simply do not exist. The data are not there. That same year, I was appointed to be a member of NASA's UAP Independent Study Team. This is our class photo, and you're going to meet Josh, who's over there in a minute. And our job was to figure out how NASA could study the topic of UAP scientifically, and truly if the agency even should. And I will tell you that over the year or so that we took to put together our report, which is available online, my thinking on both of those questions evolved quite a bit. And in that report, we noted that it was Thomas Jefferson who, in an 1808 letter, wrote, "1,000 phenomena present themselves daily which we cannot explain, but where facts are suggested, bearing no analogy with the laws of nature yet known to us, their verity needs proofs proportional to their difficulty." How do we pithily summarize this statement today? Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And so far, there is no convincing evidence for an extraterrestrial origin for even a single UAP. But that might change. I hope it would change. I, of all people, would love to know that this conversation that my dad started in the 1960s has found an answer that he would be really excited about. So how do we get down to the business of understanding what these UAP are? That is what our panel is going to address tonight, how we can figure out the provenances of these objects that we see in our skies, in space, and underwater. We're going to step away from the stigma and the sensationalism and the hyperbole that often accompanies discussions of UAP, and think about how we can harness the power of the scientific method to intentionally and rigorously and objectively collect the data that we need to understand these objects that really could be living at the boundary of what we think we know about the distribution of life in the cosmos. And even if we don't find out anything interesting about them, we'll at least learn something interesting about ourselves and our world in the process. So I'm going to bring our panel on stage now. First, we have Josh Semeter, a scientist and engineer and the director of Boston University Center for Space Physics. Come on up. Josh studies phenomena on Earth's upper atmosphere, and he's an expert when it comes to sensors, sensor design, and sensor malfunction. And he and I served on NASA's UAP committee together. Next, we have Alex Dietrich, a retired Navy pilot and educator. In 2004, Alex was a young lieutenant flying F-18 Super Hornets for the Navy Strike Fighter Squadron VFA-41 Black Aces, when she and her colleagues encountered a UAP off the coast of California, which is still unexplained and is now popularly known as the Tic Tac. She has since become an advocate for revised policies and protocols, and she can address what the US government could be doing better when it comes to prioritizing the reporting of such incidents. And last, we have Greg Eghigian, a historian of science and medicine at Pennsylvania State University. Greg has written extensively about the American and global interest in UFOs since the 1940s. His book, called After the Flying Saucers Came, A Global History of the UFO Phenomenon, came out just this past year. So we as a panel are going to have a conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions from all of you. Unless we feel like doing that sooner. So this is a democratic process. We'll see how it goes. Okay. So for this first round of questions, I wanted to chat with each of you about the way in which you relate to the phenomenon of UAP. And it strikes me that you each look at that through a different lens. Josh through the lens of science, Alex as an eyewitness, and Greg through the lens of history. So I'd like to hear a little bit from each of you about what that does. So Alex, maybe you can start off by telling us about your encounter with the Tic Tac.
Sure. I graduated and commissioned through the ROTC program in 2001, went through flight school, had my first flight on 9/11, which was a paradigm shift for the world and for me personally and professionally. And then I ended up in the strike fighter pipeline. So I flew F-18 Super Hornets for the Navy off of the USS Nimitz aircraft carrier from the squadron VFA-41. So we were stationed in Lemoore, California, and we would join the ship for our pre-deployment workups and then our deployments westbound to the Gulf at the time. So in 2004, I had just joined the squadron a few months earlier, very junior pilot, and just trying to be safe, just trying to hang on. When we launched on a routine training exercise from the carrier off the coast of California, and it was the middle of the day, it was clear blue skies, calm waters, and we were planning to go do an exercise, a scrimmage of sorts. And we were redirected by an air traffic controller within our carrier strike group. So they were on a different ship, but they were a part of our exercise. And they gave us vectors to intercept a real-world contact. So 2004, just a few years after 9/11, the hair on the back of our neck stood up. We thought, what's going on? I had no idea what was going on, being the most junior person on the flight. It was myself flying. I had a weapons systems officer in the back seat, a lieutenant commander, so more senior officer, and a more experienced aviator. I'm on the wing of the commanding officer of the squadron. He's flying, and he has a senior lieutenant in his back seat. So we have 4 folks in 2 aircraft. And as we're vectored, I say to my Wizzo, I say, what do you think is going on? He says, I don't know. Could be somebody running drugs up the coast from Mexico. I said, oh, that's cool. That's exciting. We're going to go do something. We had 0 weapons on board. There's nothing we could do about it. It's not like we were going to shoot at anything. But we proceeded to the merge, and the air traffic controller, who had this radar picture, said, hey, you're at merge plot, right? So the little blips on their screen were coming together as one. And so we look outside, and we expect to see something. We couldn't see anything outside. One of the 4 of us spots a disturbance in the water. So there's some sort of churning white water activity where there's otherwise calm waters. I said, oh no, whatever we were chasing, whoever we were hunting, has crashed and is sinking. But before I could think that, enter stage left, the Tic Tac. We call it affectionately tic-tac, like the little white breath mint, because that's what it looked like on a much larger scale. So our estimates is that it was about the size of one of our fuselage, so the body of the aircraft, but it was moving in a way that we couldn't recognize. It didn't follow our laws of physics. It didn't have our turn radius or our acceleration, all of the things that we train to master in our own cockpits and then go up against similar and dissimilar aircraft when we are in aerial combat maneuvering or basic fighter maneuvering, dogfighting in the air. So lots of expletives on the radio, lots of, what the heck is that? And then we lost sight of it. It just disappeared. The radar operator, the air traffic controller, comes on the radio and says, hey, you're not going to believe this, but it's at your cap point. So it's 50, 60 miles away from where we were at. Now, I don't know whether it was the same thing or whether it was a similar radar contact that popped up maybe out of the water. I don't want to speculate on that. We get back to the ship. We're excited. There's something out there. We don't know what it is. We can't explain it. And another aircraft from our squadron launched and was able to, and this is a testament to their acumen, they were able to get the FLIR footage, that's the forward-looking infrared, grainy black and white footage that is often associated with the USS Nimitz tic-tac encounter. So we had both visual eyewitnesses, we had the sophisticated sensor, we had the radar, which is its own type of state-of-the-art equipment, and the bringing to bear an entire military carrier strike fighter group could not, in that moment, figure out what it was in the middle of a military operating area off the coast of a densely populated U.S. city. So excited in the moment, frustrated in the aftermath with the lack of follow-up, follow-through, and investigation. Happy to answer questions when we're to that point.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. One more quick question for you, which struck me from the conversation that we had, I guess last week, was that you said that you've remained aggressively neutral about what it is that you saw.
So whenever people ask me, what do you think you saw? And I said, well, I don't know. That's why it was so weird. And I maintain an aggressively neutral stance. So by definition, for me, UFO or UAP is unidentified. That's what the U stands for. And so I have a background in engineering. I went to a math and science academy for high school. My family has a tradition of science, and I'm open-minded. That's why we do science, of course. We're curious and we want to explore. But I also need to ground that curiosity in facts and data and analysis. And so I think it's really important to go about it in a systematic way. And so that's why I agreed to speak here today and do other interviews, because I want to advocate for having a systematic approach and doing the work that needs to be done in order to answer all these questions that we have.
Yeah, thank you. Greg, speaking of being aggressively neutral and wondering how we all interpret these things, when we chatted, you said that the human history associated with the UFO phenomenon has left an enormous record for us to examine. And I'm curious about how our ideas of UFOs have evolved over the decades. Has there been a shift in how we interpret and make sense of these experiences?
Yeah, it would be strange if it hadn't, I think, as a historian. So our contemporary way of thinking about and talking about what's now called UAP, used to be called UFOs, and before that, personally my favorite term, flying saucer, began in the summer of 1947 when there were a series of sightings all across the United States. And I'd say, to my mind, one of the most interesting years to actually look at this sort of contemporary phenomenon of ours are these years 1947 to 49. Because if you look at the record and you look at what military intelligence was talking about, you look at media conversations, op-ed pieces, what you get is lots of people absolutely confused. There are no big theories. Oh, there are speculations here and there thrown out, the most common being these must be Soviet, these must be American. But lots and lots of questions, not a lot of answers. It's really not until 1950, and you had a picture of Donald Quixote's famous book, The Flying Saucers Are Real, that we get a group of people to come around who start to mint this idea that there's good evidence that it's aliens. And that's when you sort of weld these things together. But the first thing I learned when I started to dig into it, and I looked at that early phase and gone forward, is the one common thread throughout the history is that the UFO/UAP phenomenon is a mystery. It's seen as a mystery. And the thing about mystery is that a mystery is an invitation. It's like a serial podcast. You can also be an investigator. You can also get involved in this. And that mysterious element has always been the thread. But the mystery is also open-ended. It opens it up to speculation. And so the other thing I quickly learned is the mantra I lived by, and I state it all the time, is that UFOs don't make history. People make UFOs make history. That means there's lots of people and institutions and organizations and ideas that all come together over time to help frame, create, and sort of make sort of stake out the terms of the discussion. And so what we see over the course of the 1950s is you see people on one hand coming out of military intelligence looking at this and asking questions about national security. From another angle, you get religious communities who are part of the New Age spirituality, who see in this the kind of portent of a new age dawning of space sisters and space brothers. You move into the 1950s and 60s, you see new UFO organizations starting to form and shape, trading information, starting to have civilian science start to take shape. By the 1970s and 80s, you've got social scientists starting to get involved saying, what is this phenomenon about? How might psychology, sociology, folklore play a role in understanding this? And then in the 1980s, we start to see the evolution of this idea of alien abduction that seems to be drawn from other kinds of influences. So over time, it has changed. The center of gravity of the conversation has changed, always in response to other things that are going on in our society. But again, that shouldn't surprise us. That's the nature of almost any historical phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. And, like Alex, I think you said during our discussion that you've always been a little bit of a fence sitter when it comes to what these things might actually be, and that's been frustrating for people.
Yeah, I like the way Alex put it. I mean, I've always said to people that I'm a skeptically open-minded agnostic, is the way I put it.
Write that one
which is about as much fence sitting as a fence can bear, right? But no, I know that people get frustrated with me, and when I wrote the book and when I talk about this publicly. But I don't believe that what's needed from me, at least, as a historian, is to play a referee, like in soccer, who holds up a yellow card and a red card. My job is not to be the person who props up certain speculations and theories, nor is it to be the debunker. It's to really chronicle this stuff and to say that what the UFO phenomenon is really a mirror. It holds up a mirror to ourselves. Over these some 75 years in which the world has been preoccupied with this phenomenon, I would say we've learned a heck of a lot more about us than we have about aliens.
Right.
I love that. Josh, I'm going to come to you next. What does it mean to be scientific when analyzing UAP? And maybe you can show us an example of what that means.
Oh, sure.
It's like,
Yeah.
Do you want a clicker?
Well, you had quoted Carl Sagan, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And one of the problems with the UAP area is that a lot of people tend to jump immediately to the extraordinary claim. And to me, that's not satisfying. And you need to exhaust all the explanations and fully exploit all the data you have before you should, in your mind, begin to set in on an extraordinary claim. And this involves the scientific method. I mean, this was sort of codified by René Descartes in the 17th century, that how we do science, it seems so natural and so accepted that we don't think there's somebody to attribute it to even. But scientific method means you make a hypothesis, I think it might be this, and then you see if the evidence supports it. And if there's even one iota of evidence that doesn't support it, you really got to scrap it or adjust it in a major way in order to come in line with the evidence. So in order to understand the object that you saw, which we are going to keep searching for this type of thing, we really need to desperately understand the sensor we're using. So it's interesting, the current bubble in UAP enthusiasm began with a New York Times article in 2017, which referred to, and this wasn't quoting anybody, this was the author of the article, meant to be a factual article, that these objects often exhibit strange auras around them, and they move at extraordinary velocities, and they turn and do all these things without any detectable sign of propulsion. So that's amazing, and that's why I joined the UAP panel. I was like, I cannot wait to see this. I mean, I spend my time working with multispectral sensors and with radar systems, Doppler radar systems, and I was like, well, I naturally assumed if you're claiming extraordinary velocities, then there's going to be a Doppler weather type measurement, like tornado, we know that wind is moving 300 miles per hour because we can measure it with a radar. So what I thought I'd do is just be very moderately technical here and try to get you to understand one of the most extraordinary things about that 2017 article, and that is there is zero mention that the data were recorded, the footage was recorded with an infrared sensor. And an infrared sensor gives you an entirely different view of the world, and you need to grow accustomed to it before you interpret it. And again, we want to do this. We want to find the extraordinary stuff. We just want it to be truly extraordinary. This is a UAP. I don't know, should I stand?
Up to you.
Should I dance? No. Anyway, this is a video that was recorded from the ground, and this is some object in the sky that we can't understand. And you'll immediately notice, all right, so this is a thermal image. This is what we call mid-wave thermal infrared. So it's got a cold spot in the black there and a hot spot right next to it, right? And this is what we see. This is what the Navy pilots were reporting when they saw these at FLIR videos. And if we let the video go a little bit, we see in this case it's moving upwards. And the question is the object moving upwards? Well, we really don't know because we have no frame of reference. So let's back the camera out, and suddenly we have a frame of reference with which we can start to talk about the velocity of the object, okay? And so this glow that you're seeing around there's this aura of black around that object. What in the heck could be causing that? Well, that's actually a standard effect of an infrared camera. Okay, it's called a unsharp mask. It's a filter that they apply to show you the object in clarity. The object keeps moving and eventually blinks around for a while, and then you realize it's a Boeing 767 in this case. So this has no bearing on anything Alex talked about, but it does have bearing on interpretation of a lot of these UAP events where we actually do have data. Okay, so you can see the dark aura around it is still there, right? So it's interesting in that way. And before I talk about this, so the other thing is the extraordinary velocity, right? These objects can seem like they have an extraordinary velocity, and I don't know, how many of you are familiar with the parallax effect? A few of you. Okay, well, you can do it right here in the room. If you hold your thumb out in front of you and maybe point it at my head or something like that, and move your head back and forth, your thumb is moving very fast with respect to the background. And if you move your thumb instead of your head, it's exactly the same, indistinguishable as to whether the sensor is moving or the actual object is moving. You actually have to close one eye in order to get something that looks like a sensor. So here's an example of parallax, right? If we look at this movie, how many of you think that balloon is moving at 1,000 miles per hour? Right? It's not. It's near the aircraft. The aircraft's flying by, and so this is sensor motion that's causing that. And the point being that you have to account for that. It's not that it's the only explanation, but ultimately we have two things going on at once. We have the head motion and the thumb motion together, and ultimately AARO, the All Anomalies Resolution Office, finally settled in on their official explanation for this video, which has this amazing technology that can lock onto a target, and it's essentially moving at a very slow velocity, with zero velocity actually being one of the most probable explanations. And so you really get this impression that it's moving fast when in fact it's the sensor that's moving. So we need to account for all of these effects when we deal with UAP data. So I'll leave it at that, I think, for now. But I remain interested and hopeful that we will get to see some things that just don't make any sense by the laws of physics that we currently know. But so far, I haven't encountered it, and if anybody out there has, let me know.
I will note that I think on February 5th or 6th, actually, AARO had published an explanation for this event, which is known as Go Fast, right?
Yeah.
So it's actually unclassified and online now if you want to see how they work that out. Josh, I'm going to stick with you for one more second. I'm going to try to back up and put our title slide back up.
Oh.
No, you're good. When we were talking last week, you had said that, if we're approaching UAP from a scientific context, which I think we're all very interested in doing, we need better data. And then you followed that up by saying, and we can now be pretty specific by what we mean when we say that we need better data. So maybe I'll start with you here and then open it up. What kind of data are you talking about? What do we need?
Yeah, so we have a lot of distributed sensor networks out there for other purposes that we can leverage and exploit for the study of anomalous phenomena, right? And one system that we talked about on the UAP panel is the NEXRAD weather radar system. We have these radar systems spinning around, like the type you see on the top of your boat. A lot of you probably have boats, right? And we have these things that you can find the maps online. And if you have a sighting, whether it be by just an interested citizen or anything like that, there's no excuse for not being able to go back to the NEXRAD data and look for pings off of the object. And what has to be done oftentimes is not a full-on, from-scratch investment of a new facility, but let's look at what we have and see how we can better use it. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't know, citizen science is also an important part of this. Mm-hmm. Citizens, I don't know if I could talk about that a little bit.
I think I'll maybe hold that one for later, but just thinking about what kinds of observations we might want. And Alex, I'm actually really curious about your take on this one too, because you did have an experience where I'm sure if the opportunity had arose, you would have wanted to gather more information about the object that you saw.
Yeah, I was really surprised that we didn't pause the exercise, that we didn't do a training timeout and re-divert all of the assets that we had available in that moment to investigate, to shine a light and say, maybe this is an adversary, maybe this is somebody, trundling through the middle of a military exercise off the coast of California. Maybe we should figure out who this is or what it is. And instead, everyone did a collective shrug and said, that was weird. Mm-hmm. Okay, back to work, back to the mission at hand, which was getting ready to go, provide close air support to troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. So another reason that I speak about this is to help reduce the stigma and to say to folks, hey, if you see something, you should say something. But the problem then is where do I report? How do I report? What do I report? So I think, that we all have now these Ring doorbell cameras. We're posting great videos of our package delivery people interacting with our cats. But they're also capturing weird things happening in the sky. There was a flurry of activity near me in Boulder where, I was getting a barrage of, what is this? What do you think this is? And it was all these doorbell camera footages. It turns out that there was a meteor that struck and or didn't. Was the meteor right? Is when it strikes, right? Anyway, it created this spectacular seed in the sky. And as people should, they've captured and sort of tried to direct their evidence into a central place. My LinkedIn message box is not necessarily the right place to do that analysis. But wouldn't it be great if we had an agency or a whole of government approach, which is part of what the NASA independent study said, is this DoD responsibility? Is this an issue of national security? Is this NASA's responsibility? Is this, for science? And the FAA had a seat at the table, and they said, hey, what about flight safety, which of course is top of mind for us in the last several weeks with all of our mishaps. So if there was something in the airspace when you're getting on your next flight, Delta or United flight out of here, wouldn't you like to have the confidence that the airspace is clear and anything that's unidentified is accounted for?
I would like that.
I would.
Yeah, I mean, if I could piggyback on that, I actually have a question really for all three of you or any of you who want to answer it. I think for a lot of folks, a lot of us lay folks, we don't know the difference between the alphabet soup of Aero, FAA, NASA. If you're an insider, you know that what these refer to. But do you have an answer for a lot of us that could give us a sense of how is, say, what Aero is doing different from what the charge NASA has been involved with and the FAA? How do you think of the difference between them? Because there's clearly some important differences there, right? Or do you just see this as all part of the same goulash of options?
Well, I'll start by saying, and this is me as a 20-year military officer, things that are collected on DoD systems, it might not be classified what we're looking at, right? If I snap a picture of the Hollywood sign on a FLIR in my F-18, the Hollywood sign is not classified, but the methods and means of capture might be classified. So that sophisticated technology that I use might then deem everything that's collected on it unavailable, unaccessible to those other agencies. So that's part of the problem. Mm-hmm. And the real big problem, once we say, okay, let's agree on how we're going to capture, archive, share out this info, the biggest problem is who's going to pay for it, right? Mm-hmm. Congress has to authorize and appropriate funds to make this happen. Mm. You've got to pay for the systems, you've got to pay for the storage, you've got to pay for the analysts to do their work. Mm-hmm. Everybody at the table says, oh,
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, at NASA, they've really embraced this idea of research to operations, R2O, and O2R, operations to research.
So what does that mean?
And so what it means is that
English.
Exactly. I'm contributing to the alphabet soup. NASA has this entire mission around what they term space weather these days. So it is an agency that is into discovery science, but they also realize that there's a application for the data sets they record, from research to contribute to understanding why your GPS drops out or understanding how the atmosphere expands and contracts and causes satellite drag that harms satellites. So energetic radiation from the sun disrupting electronics and satellites. So the connection is so tight and so valuable to exploit that they've developed an entire office around space weather. And I see that synergy, which is within the agency of NASA, maybe translating to DoD NASA collaborations, right? So, I mean, DoD is firmly interested in national security. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that the NASA office in charge of UAP, which there is one now, with one person, I believe.
One person. Yeah.
But they are involved with finding the science behind things. And, you know, the connection between the two is just so strong that there's always been NASA DoD collaborations, but this is one area where it really could pay benefit.
Yeah, I think a lot of the discussions we had on the study team were what can NASA do that's complementary to what the DoD is doing, because obviously, you know, DoD is going to be a lot more concerned with national security, the implications there, and NASA has more flexibility to go and explore the discovery space to think about doing science and what we might learn. I want to pivot a little bit. Greg, a question for you, because I've heard a couple of comments just in our discussion already about some of the stories that have been published that are relating information about UAP in the popular press. Josh, I think you said the New York Times article was meant to be a factual article, which I imagine you said with quite a bit of side-eye. As a journalist, let's go ahead and throw something on us. And Alex, you were talking about the stigma involved in reporting, and of course that's something that can be exacerbated in the press as well. So Greg, I'm curious about the role that you think the media has played in our understanding of UFOs historically. And then I know you have a slide related to that, but I also want us to start thinking from there, what can we do better? And how can we educate all of you, the consumers of information, to be smarter when it comes to reading these kinds of things?
Yeah, I mean, there's a really great example, very briefly, of something that happened in 1952. So, summer of 1952, a very famous set of sightings of UFOs over Washington, D.C., sparked a whole set of sightings all over the United States. So, in August of 1952, the South Bend Tribune in Indiana decided to put together what was called, that's a newspaper, put together what they called Operation Flying Saucer, which would be a night in August when the entire, all of South Bend would be mobilized to look for flying saucers. They got civil defense, military radar, police. They had a radio station attached to them. The radio station was broadcasting these things, and they had a hotline. You could call into the radio station if you saw something, and then they would announce it. Notre Dame Stadium had about 2,000 people in there with telescopes looking for things. Observers said there were people on roofs, in yards. And they came up with about 100 sightings that night that they then passed on to the Air Force. God knows what the Air Force did with it all. But I thought to myself, that is a great example of how media becomes part of the story. So I've got this slide. I don't know how to work that, if you don't mind, if that works. Of something.
Hello.
Let's see. Oops, we just skipped over.
There we go.
Is that it? I hope you can see that okay. So this is something I put together a few years ago. This runs from 1985 to 2014. So 25 U.S. newspapers, small, large, across the United States. I looked for headlines of stories that either had the term flying saucer, flying saucers in it, or UFO, UFOs in it. And this is what I came up with. If 2017 and 18 was there, you'd see another spike, by the way. I guarantee it. I once showed this chart to historians over at the National Air and Space Museum, and I said, so what do you make of this? And one of them said, quite brilliantly, she said, well, it's obvious. The aliens come every 10 years. But you do see these spikes, and we don't have time for this now. What I usually do when I show this to a group of intelligent people like yourselves, I ask you to try to figure out what is going on in 1987, what's going on in 1997, and what's going on in 2007. But I'll give away the gig. And the punchline is, in 1987, 2 books come out. Bud Hopkins' Intruders and Whitley Strieber's Communion, the 2 best-selling books about alien abduction. Gets lots of news coverage. 1997, Yeah, there was this thing called the Phoenix Lights that made some news, but the big news was a certain very tragic story about a religious community called Heaven's Gate, which some of you probably remember, in which several dozens of people committed suicide as part of a UFO cult. 2007 is the hardest to figure out, but you'd have to remember a presidential election and a certain Democratic candidate by the name of Dennis Kucinich, who ran for office and admitted that he had seen a UFO, and that was the end of his presidential run when he announced that. And that got a lot of coverage. So you can see that media coverage has cycles to it.
It does. And I wonder, open-ended question, what can we do better? I mean, I'm curious. Alex, we've talked about this.
I get a lot of requests for interviews. So that 2017 article came about, and there was a Pentagon report that, again, wasn't classified because we don't know what we saw that day, but included our names and information. And so it was released, posted on the internet somehow, and we were doxxed. So I get a flood of inquiries and invitations for all sorts of media and news outlets. I try my best to vet them and say who's sort of credible and worthwhile. You know, I said yes to the BBC. I said no to TMZ. But even the serious reporters, either there's spooky music in the background, or snickering and sort of it's the lighthearted fun story, and that's really grating. That's really disappointing. You want to say, hey, yes, I saw something weird. We don't know what it was. I'm not crazy. I don't think any of you are crazy. And if you see something, do your best to capture it. Here's maybe a checklist or methodology to follow, a protocol. I get asked all sorts of great questions. Now, my favorite is, did you see a shadow? I have no idea. I wasn't looking for a shadow at the time, but what a great question. And so you can be sure if I see something else weird, I'm going to say, is there a shadow? Lots of other good questions. Let's capture that, and let's structure it in a way so that frontline operators, train conductors, long-haul truckers, people who might, that should be sober and might have an encounter because they're looking up and out, can then be that sensor, or at least set up a flag, send up a flare, and say, hey, there's something here, and then have the next steps in contacting first responders or Aero or whoever the right agency is, to then say, okay, we're looking for a needle in a haystack, and at least this is the right part of the.
I'm curious, you were just mentioning a whole class of individuals who should be sober and are looking outside all the time. We talked a lot before about the role of citizen science, of, citizens literally are the ones who are seeing these objects. Maybe that's some of you. What can this audience do? What kind of data can this audience gather? Is there a role for citizen science in understanding UAP? I think all three of you have strong feelings on this one, so Josh, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, the problem with AI, for instance, is that it's easy to generate fake UAP events, and so we do have to kind of police against that. And citizen science has a natural way of doing that, right? If you have a network of people connected through social media, one of you sees something in the sky. Hey, anybody else see this from this location? You can imagine a scenario or even a habit that's developed where everybody goes out to see if they can. And if you get observations of an object from multiple locations, it's self-validating, right? It's really difficult to fake an event if it's viewed by 100 different people at 100 different locations. And the other valuable thing about that is that this gets to processing. If you want to know how fast an object is moving, I mentioned one way, which is a radar system. And another way to do it is just simply look at it from at least 3, 4, 5 different angles and go back to your trig book. And you realize that you can actually triangulate where that object is, do it as a function of time, and track its velocity. And all these people who claim that these strange little bugs flying around the sky in their camera, are in the outer space regime and they're, they're kissing satellites and disappearing again and things like that, I mean, you'll know if those objects are actually at 1,000 kilometers altitude or if they're at 50 kilometers or lower. So it's not just that there's an opportunity. I almost feel like it's a complete necessity at this point, given where we're going with generative AI and the types of fakeries that you can develop.
So would you build a platform for cell phones or something where people could submit images, data, information like that?
Well, we have that kind of thing in other domains. A colleague of mine, Liz McDonald at Goddard, developed Aurorasaurus, which is it's a similar kind of thing. If you see a strange, Mother Nature makes exotic phenomena in the night sky as well. That's really interesting to study. And the aurora, it turns out, is a phenomenon we really don't understand very well. And so this is a platform for people who have collected pictures of the aurora. They can, log where they took it and put the data in there. And, we have entrepreneurial efforts to do that with UAP as well. We've been, Enigma, right?
Yeah, there's a few apps.
Okay.
I love the anecdote. This is a story out of Australia. I read the article. The whole town saw something. Purpley lights, it was glowing. Clearly this is a UFO crash, right? And they all called the sheriff, or whatever they call them down under, and the sheriff drove out on this long road towards the lights. Turns out it was a cannabis farm whose automatic shades had failed to go down at dusk. And so it was the grow lights that were reflecting off of a low cloud cover. But I love that they just said, hey, this is weird. This looks weird, this looks funny. A bunch of folks are reporting it, and the sheriff said, this is weird, I'll go check it out. Right? Probably had his hand on the sidearm. And so that's the kind of approach we should say. We should say, and the boomerang, yeah. Here's a little side kangaroo. That's how we should approach it. If people see something weird, you should take them seriously and that you should back them up and investigate. And then there hopefully is a reasonable answer. But if there isn't, then let's get out there and
But does it? I mean, let me play devil's advocate, because I get a sense that we oftentimes there hasn't been enough respect shown witnesses for what they see, and even today you will still hear scientists who are researching this saying, the witnesses are okay, but let's get some data through sensors, right? So the instruments are always the key. So isn't it true that more information, raw information, isn't always helpful for the scientists? That the noise just drowns out the signal so much that, and as you say, particularly given the fact that the resources aren't there, the money is not there, the people aren't there to do it, the work, would it overburden what exists today if all that data was coming in and figuring out how you deal with it all, right? Wouldn't that be the case?
I think we have to merge the two. So just like police wearing body cams, right? They can have them running 24/7, but if they don't have that little button to push that says there's an incident here, and it captures 3 minutes before and 3 minutes after, you are looking for the needle in the haystack, right? You could have thousands of hours of data from the body cam, but if you don't have somebody flagging it and saying, look here, and I think at the NASA Independent Study Kickoff, we heard from the folks who were talking about the different satellites, right? They're the satellites that are going around and around, and they were saying this is how much we can cover, and this is how much storage space on our hard drive. At a certain point we have to overwrite, otherwise we run out of storage. And then there's the satellites that are fixed that just look at one spot on the ground. So we have this assumption. Hollywood does us a disservice by making us think that everything, everywhere, all at once is being captured, but it's not. And so if I'm off the coast of California and I say, oh, it's November 14th, 2004 at 11 a.m., something weird's happening here, and the satellite's on the other side of the world, and I got to wait for it to circle back around before we can even get the picture, right? What's the mechanism where we create a system of sensors and authorization to maybe look in people's backyards or within our own borders, but it's a whole nother issue of policy. And but the point is, it's been 20 years since my encounter, and the needle has moved barely a whisper in terms of coming up with a systematic approach. The agencies to lead the effort. But so glad to see so many people here today with genuine curiosity.
Yeah, I come back a little bit to answer the question about, it is true you can overwhelm people with data. So I sort of take it as a given that we can develop the technologies. That's what AI is supposed to be good at. AI can analyze data for you. AI can look for outliers. You can make a scientific hypothesis, and you can train an AI to try to find data that either matches or refutes that hypothesis. So all of that is coming, right? That's the drudgery work of too much data. And then, I like to look for efficiencies, government efficiencies. Is there that we can, for example, we have. Sorry. We have, in my field of research, sort of the near space plasma research, looking at optical emissions from the atmosphere, we have a network of fisheye cameras across Canada and the US that have complete 100% coverage. And they're designed to study this natural phenomenon. But naturally, the outlier stuff associated with UAP is going to be in these data as well. And there's only so much you can do in a day or in a life, but I mean, we've got a lot of algorithms for identifying UAPs. The needle in the haystack can be found in using statistical methods that actually look for something that shouldn't be there.
Yeah, I feel like AI is kind of a double-edged sword in this conversation.
It is.
Because machine learning can help you find those things, but then also you can make all these things that are fake. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I think it's time to hop into some questions from the audience. I am definitely curious to hear what your questions are, and I'm just going to set some quick ground rules, which are to please be respectful and please ask a question. I also think we want to stay away from asking us to adjudicate any kind of event or experience that you might have with a UAP. I'm not sure that's probably the best use of the room's time.
You can send it to my LinkedIn.
Send it to Alex's LinkedIn. Yeah, and I think Eric is going to be circulating with the microphone, and I can't really see hands, so maybe Eric, you can do that.
Well, let me give you. I don't think my microphone's on.
No, it is.
Okay.
Just take a while.
Let me give you a heads up. We're going to turn the lights on, so be prepared. There you go. Give you a little warning. So yeah, raise your hand. We have a live stream audience. We're recording, so we want to capture the audio of your question. So I'll come by with the microphone. Yeah.
Yes, this is for Alex.
Yes.
How long was your encounter? Or are we talking 10 seconds, a minute, 10 minutes?
Yeah, so from the first vector, so when the radar operator on the ship started vectoring us until we broke contact, it was several minutes. The visual, for me, again, as the most junior pilot, was 10, 12 seconds, but for the other more senior aviators in the crew, it was a few minutes. Yeah.
And I don't know if you know this, but there's a table full of stuff over here that Alex has brought in that you can interact with, including a helmet, some documents. There's a really nice 3D printed model of the Tic Tac that you can check out, like a TSA officer.
I did. They asked me what it was. I said, I don't know. Trying not to get arrested. Unidentified.
All right, we have a question towards the back of the room here.
A question I have is, if one of the government organizations you listed were to become convinced that they had encountered a UAP that originated outside of Earth, what would be the protocol and timeline would you expect to release that information to the public?
Anybody know?
Well, my answer is that I think it would be immediate. And I'm among those that do not believe the government is holding back information from us in this area. I mean, I don't know if any of you have read the director, Sean Kirkpatrick. He wrote a beautiful Scientific American piece when he resigned from Arrow, talking about exactly this issue that, I can't fathom how, in all these years, in the last 100 years, there's been some organization to keep all this information secret. I actually think it would be disseminated rapidly, but maybe others.
And it sort of begs the question too: is what kind of event or observation would happen that wouldn't also be recognized by perhaps astronomers, meteorologists, other civilians out there who see something and detect something? It strikes me as it would. I don't know that scenario where only people with high classified clearance have access to that data and that information.
I will say one thing about the folks who are looking for radio transmissions from other civilizations. They do have a laid out kind of detection and then dissemination protocol, and the first two steps are basically boiled down to: one, make sure it's real, and two, tell everyone.
All right, well, back of the room on your right.
Playing off what you said just now about astronomers, the amateur astronomy community is huge. I've been a member of it for 50 years, and very few of us have ever seen anything that we can't explain. And so I'm wondering, how would the amateur astronomy community, which includes observational astronomers and astrophotographers like me, if we were to see something, how much weight do you think that would or should be given that we would be able to back up what we have with real data?
Josh?
Well, one comment I would make about that is I don't like I've wondered about that. This idea, I saw something strange and we can't find it again. That kind of thing. I mean, if some alien technology is barreling towards our planet, we're going to encounter it in different ways at different altitudes, and it's going to land somewhere and explode and all this. I don't know. It seems like it would be observed across various modes of observation and by various communities, as you said, that it would get out there immediately. And so your data as an amateur astronomer would play a vital role. Maybe that's the first encounter with the object. Certainly, let's take, for example, meteors impacting Earth, right? Amateur astronomers have a long history of finding those, and those are really relevant to human life on the planet. So there's a strong analog in the natural cosmological world, I think.
All right, we have a question from an online viewer. Pamela asked, are other countries also collecting data on UAPs, and has there been any coordination with the U.S. data?
It's a great question.
There historically has been a number of countries collecting data, and there are quite a few today. While some countries have gotten out of the business, probably most prominent being Great Britain, got out of the business of collecting data in the 2000 noughts, but they'd been in it for a long time. But Uruguay, Chile, several countries in South America, France continues to do so. And even in cases where you don't have individual offices or agencies collecting information, there's usually somebody in a government office in some sort of service or intelligence capacity who is at least gathering some of this stuff and making it available. The issue of cooperation is always a question. There is, I know, an effort afoot in the European Union for there to be more collaboration and exchange of information about this. The thing that always runs aground is this issue of classification and the extent to which different intelligence services want to share information across countries and internationally. Yeah.
All right, we have a question about midway back in the room on your right.
Hi. This kind of goes into that point exactly in what Alex was saying earlier. How important, given the U.S. has very highly classified technology that can detect many, many things, how important is that data getting declassified? And also, what are some steps to declassify that kind of data?
It's classified.
No comment.
You want me to? I mean, there's a reason that our methods and means are classified, and that's a real, and it has to do with real adversaries that we know about. And so I get that it's frustrating, and there's a sense of urgency to declassify, but the cost benefit just isn't there in terms of the risk that we would be taking with our clear and present danger.
Can I just say one thing about that is I think a misperception on the part of a lot of people. There is just literally tens of thousands of pages of documents that have been declassified worldwide by intelligence services and some civilian science organizations across the world since the 2000 noughts. A massive including the United States. We have a lot of documents and a lot of material that has been declassified from basically the 1940s on into as far in the UK, right on into the 2000s. So we have a lot of declassified documents out there to look at. That would be the place for a lot of people to begin to do the work of digging and see if there's something intriguing in there.
And with our own incident, as I mentioned, because we don't know what it was and the nature of it happening, the reports that are available they're not classified, and they've actually been posted online, and you can find them and stalk me if you'd like. LinkedIn. Preferred.
Yeah.
But I'm not trying to be coy here. The reason that we pay so much in our taxes is to develop this technology to maintain that advantage, and so that's the reason that we end up in this bind of saying, hey, well, what about science and what about safety? And we say number one is security.
All right, I know there's some hands in the front of the room. I'll get up there, but we have a question in the back of the room.
How would they travel over those hundreds of thousands of light years?
We talked about that at lunch, didn't we?
Yeah, we did.
How would they?
Yeah, like the warp drive.
Warp drive.
How do you get over that?
Yeah, I mean, we've had some discussions over seltzer so far right, about this. And, there was a time before Albert Einstein discovered the speed limit, the speed of light, when the answer would be, let's just build spacecraft to go faster and faster and faster and faster, and that's all we need to do. Now we realize that there's a limit to how fast you can go, and what happens when you go really fast is that time slows down for you. And if you went out to, how many light years? 100
Hundreds
billion?
of thousands.
Yeah.
Say the Milky Way.
So you're traveling. So nobody you knew, and in fact the entire human civilization might disappear in the time that they perceive as they go out to find information about aliens or whatever. So we're a little bit stuck, and I know you haven't studied special relativity in your classes yet, right?
Probably not.
That's next year.
Next year.
Next year.
Yeah. No, but you're going to love it when you get to it. I assume you like physics. So, yeah, keep that one in mind because it's very stimulating to learn about.
Right, we have a question in the front of the room.
Yeah, my question is, so if data comes up and says, yes, these phenomenons existed, what are we going to do with that information? What does that mean in the future? Like, we're going, oh, yeah, you were correct. You saw that. Good job. What does it mean?
Do you mean if we learn that something is extraterrestrial in origin, or if
Yeah,
we learn
like
that something is actually
we prove that they were here, they existed, they flew by in the skies, and it becomes unclassified, and everybody knows, yeah, it happens.
What would that do for you?
I don't know. That's why I'm asking you guys. Like, what does it mean for the future if it's confirmed?
I'm always curious about how people would respond, because I think everybody has an individual response to this question.
Yeah,
So
it's true.
yeah, that's why I turned the question around.
What's a
on
good
you.
From the
It's a great
military
question.
pilot here, I think friend or foe, right? Are they here to hurt us, or are they here to help us? And so,
Well, they haven't heard us yet, have they? I mean, nobody
That's no.
reported, I can't find so-and-so.
Yeah, no, and that has been historically the argument of,
One could argue.
intelligence services. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, sorry.
Just thought occurred to me, like if Darwinism is the method under which life evolves everywhere in the universe, then the answer is it's terrifying. If somebody shows up that's more advanced than us,
Yeah.
survival of the fittest, whereas if it's the other way around, if we find a life form ourselves on Europa when we land there and sail around the methane seas and so forth, then the bad news is for them.
Yeah.
Because we're going to take at least one of them back and cut them up good.
suckers.
All right, we're at the little past the end of the program time, so let's end with one final question from this guy up front here.
Right. Thanks, Eric. I feel so honored. Yeah, first of all, thank you. This is amazing. Alex, I'd just like to expand on one comment you made, which is Hollywood does us a disservice, right? And this is a question for everybody, but, we have an expectation in our sightings or our ideas of being abducted or interpreting the tic-tac that there is an answer. Right, and we've seen it. We've seen Star Wars. We've seen Mandalorian. I love them all, but really, how, in your collective wisdom, does our lived experiences as consumers of media become adulterated from science and what we can know from science, and as organizations that promote science, what can we do about it?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, I guess the way I would start with it is I actually start with what I think that those popular representations of science and what science really is goes to something we were discussing earlier today that they share, and that is a great curiosity and a great love for discovery. That's what connects them. After that, that's where things start to separate. And the reality is that discovery, that curiosity. And I would say this is true not just of the natural sciences, this is true of all scholarship, is what you soon discover once you go to graduate school, is that things can be kind of boring. Things can take some time. There's a great deal of patience. And the one other thing is the qualification of conclusions, right? Very rarely do you have a definitive conclusion. You have a very qualified one. But even in that, it is to discover that you can find within that routine and those set of principles and methods within scholarship comes the delight of always being surprised. And I would say, I've been doing this a long time, I'm always, almost every day, being surprised and shocked by things I find out. And that's one of the grand things that I think we can hang our hat on.
Yeah.
All right, I lied. Let's do one more question.
This is two questions, but one, are the tractor beams real? And two, how do they abduct you?
That's
What a great way to end the
question
program.
on.
Tractor beam.
Well, you'd have to get Kate McKinnon in on this.
How do they affect you?
Yeah.
How would they affect you?
I don't know how tractor beams work or how they would work, right? Ultimately, I think in the science fiction, The idea is that you create a really hyperdense thing that has large gravity that actually pulls you, right? And we don't have any technology to do that yet, but there are theoretically ways to do that. I think we might have talked about this a little bit. You could make an object out of neutron matter, where if you have a little teaspoon of it, it actually is, you're halfway to a black hole, and that would act as a tractor beam, and it would probably, rip the fingers off of your hand or something like that. But
ouch.
I think
Don't do it.
Now you sleep well tonight, all right?
It
always
just
ask the
works.
toughest
That's all you need to know. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
So can I say something about abduction?
Sure.
So this is, there's a doctor in Hawaii who unwittingly became a neurologist to abductees. Somebody ended up in his office, said, I've been having headaches or tremors or whatever the symptoms were, and as any good doctor would do, and the intake said, well, when did this start? And the person sheepishly said, well, right after my abduction. The doc didn't skip a beat, didn't laugh, didn't shame them, he said, well, when was that? And they said on the date or the time frame, wrote it down. He proceeded to then do whatever scans, MRI, or I don't know what other tests they would give, and then gave this patient some relief. So the patient goes back and they go to their online forum of other abductees and says, hey, I found a doctor who actually took me seriously and gave me relief for these symptoms that I've had ever since my experience. So all of these other abductees flocked to this neurologist. And the neurologist said, oh my God, okay, all right. And so after seeing these folks, he said, look, I'm not saying that all of these folks have been abducted with a tractor beam or abducted however the aliens do it. I don't know. But what I can tell you is I'm looking at a batch of data here. And when I scan their brains, the physiology is different. And so is it their brains that are making them think that they've been abducted, this sensation? We've all had deja vu, right? That's something that happens in our brains that we all say, oh, yeah, deja vu.
Yeah.
Deja vu. Mm-hmm. So is there something that's going on in their brains that says, oh, I've been abducted? Or have they been abducted and then that's the scar on their brains? Who knows? But wouldn't it be worth looking into? Wouldn't it be worth having a systematic approach?
I think Josh needs to make his teaspoonful of neutron star.
Neutron man. Yeah.
We have one more question right here with this guy.
Oh, no.
No?
I think we're good.
Okay.
Yep.
Good.
Thank you, Nadia, Greg, Alex, Josh.
Thank you, everyone.
Fascinating stuff. We could probably stay another hour or two talking about it. Thank you all for attending tonight's program. Visit lindahall.org for all of our upcoming events. March 27th, Andrew Simeon from the SETI Institute. May 1st, astronaut Nicole Stott. Those are the headliners. So thank you, and
Nice.
be careful out there.
Thanks.